Hello everyone, and welcome to class 7 of the course Organizing in Times of Crisis. This session looks at integrating refugees into the labor market as a collective endeavor. My name is Almina Bešić. I am an assistant professor at Johannes Kepler University Linz, and my main research area is looking at how refugees and other migrants are integrated into the labor market. And I have done several studies in Austria and other European countries that show how challenging actually this process is. And today's lecture is supposed to give you an insight into the process itself. So when we look at refugee movements, you can see that often work is described as key for refugees to settle into new host societies, into the environment, etc. But it is unclear how really labor market integration is organized. And in many different host societies, it is organized in different ways with different actors who have different roles, of course. But when you look across research studies, as well as discussions of policymakers and business practitioners, everybody agrees that work is crucial for successful participation in society for refugees. And I have done a lot of studies that show that refugees as well themselves see work as key for participating in society. And I'm citing only 2 studies here that show similar results. Also, when you look at news articles, you see that work is often described as the main point for refugees when they enter in a new host society. However, there are many challenges that refugees encounter across different levels that affect their work trajectory. And you have seen in the literature that I have posted a very good paper that explains these different challenges across different levels. And I will talk about this in a bit more detail on the next couple of slides. The challenges manifest across the macro level, the so-called institutional level, across the organizational level and individual level. And refugee employment itself is shaped by different roles of a variety of actors. Often public service organizations and mainly the Public Employment Service are at the forefront of assisting refugees. And many studies that I cite here show this already across Europe, but also in other countries. And it is a complex process that involves these different kind of organizations and actors. And as well, it is a dynamic process, meaning that it can change over time. And you can see now in the current refugee movement of Ukrainian refugees, specifically in Europe, how things have changed compared, for example, to 2015. So what is it that I would like you to learn or take with you after listening to this course? So I have key learning outcomes. The first is to understand the challenges of labor market integration of refugees, for refugees themselves, but also specifically for those actors and organizations that support them in their integration. And understand the interconnectedness of different levels in labor market integration. So labor market integration is not just about getting a job, but it is also about who is supporting you once you have the job, who is supporting, for example, a refugee in their longer-term career efforts. And as a last point, understanding the complexity of organizing support for the labor market integration, as well as the challenges with an overwhelming focus on employment first of refugees. As I mentioned in the first slide, when you look across media and other discussions, employment is really being sold as a key for refugees and for the success. But if you look only at employment, and I will explain this a little bit more in the following slides, this is simply not enough to ensure a sustainable integration of people who are seeking refuge in a host country. So how can you capture the complexity of refugee labor market integration? I'm showing here 2 frameworks or models that work very well in explaining these complexities. The first one is the canvas ceiling, where you also have the article explaining this in more detail, which is based on the relational framework. And the second one is the ActionNet framework by Barbara Czerniawska, who is an organizational scholar. And I will explain each of these in more details in the following slides. So the canvas ceiling represents a relational view of the labor market integration, whereby interconnected and systemic barriers can affect refugee employment and the subsequent integration in the labor market. And it is characterized as a process, so it doesn't stop once you enter the labor market, and includes the interplay of several factors across different levels, as I mentioned, the institutional, the organizational, and the individual level. And you can see it here on this graph explained in a bit more detail. The institutional level factors on your left include immigration regulations for different kinds of refugees, for example, for asylum seekers versus those that are recognized refugees. The qualification, accreditation, as well as education, as well as the socio-political climate that impacts very much if employers even want to employ refugees. If the discussion is a negative one, this often has an effect and has been shown in several studies. On the other side, you have the individual level factors, which include, of course, individual demographics. You can see this as well, very well in European discussions. If you compare the 2015 refugee movements that are sometimes also described as a crisis, where actually way less people have come into Europe compared to the current movements from Ukraine. But the demographics were much different compared to 2015 and now. Then you have the language skills of the refugees, their social networks, if they have any that can support them in entering the labor market, as well as their psychological responses, so mental health issues, issues of trauma that people bring with them, and their own motivation in how to really enter the labor market. And then you have actually a crucial level, which is the organizational level, which can include employers, but also self-employment of refugees, as well as support organizations. And in this presentation, I'm actually focusing on employers and support organizations, although self-employment is often a very important avenue for refugees when accessing the labor market. The next model that I'm looking at is the ActionNet framework by Barbara Czerniawska. Thereby, Czerniawska actually describes a net framework of different kinds of organizations. And we can use this actually for showing refugee integration as a complex action net of different actors that are connected to each other via certain actions. And these actors can be individuals who are using their time to support voluntarily refugees. This can be organizations like the Public Employment Service that supports refugees in entering the labor market. These can be other organizations, for example, teaching language courses, etc. And the Refugee Integration Action Net is constructed and maintained through repeated behaviors. This means that those actors and organizations that are using the ActionNet or that participate in the ActionNet learn from past experiences. And if we take now the refugee movement from Ukrainian people coming to Europe, those organizations that are now actually very quick in helping them can use their experience with, for example, the movements of refugees in 2015 that entered Europe, where they have learned what works and what doesn't work. Not everything can be used one-on-one, of course, in different kinds of people who are coming to host countries, but a lot of those behaviors can be repeated and can be adapted to new settings in the ActionNet. But how do these models actually translate to practice? I will show on the next couple of slides an example of how this action net and the canvas ceiling really work in practice. And I'm going to use for that the example of Austria and the support of refugees coming to this country. Austria is an interesting example because it is one of the countries that in the 2015 refugee movement has admitted a large number of refugees. If you compare it with other European countries, it has been one of the few countries that has admitted the majority of people based on the size of the population, and the other one was, for example, Sweden. So, for example, in 2015, when there was the most movement of people searching refuge in Europe, Austria has admitted over 88,000 people to Austria who have sought asylum. Not everyone has gotten asylum since that time. And the numbers have been much lower since then, and the reasons include, for example, the EU-Turkey deal and a much more stringent policy on refugee integration in the country. But since the start of the war in Ukraine, over 60,000 people have actually registered in Austria, and many more have entered the country, but a lot of people are moving on. So Austria has actually a lot of experience in integrating refugees into the labor market as well as in society. Another reason why Austria is a good example to explain the barriers that refugees encounter in accessing the labor market and to explain the action net really that is working towards this goal is that since 2015, the integration in general, but specifically labor market integration policy, is actually moving towards assimilation. And in that sense, assimilation means really adapting to the host society without having a two-way look at integration. This also means that the integration itself has become much more oriented towards labor market first. So in 2015, there has been an initial welcome culture, so-called Willkommenskultur in German. But since then, the policy moved quickly away from a humanitarian response towards this labor market first policy and managing migration. But if you fast forward to 2022, with the current refugee movements, you can see a new wave of support emerging. The questions that are still open is how will this overwhelming support actually for Ukrainian refugees in Austria, how will this develop in the next couple of months or next couple of years, whether this policy change that has happened since 2015 and specifically in Austria in 2017 due to political reasons, whether this will be the same for Ukrainian refugees compared to those people that have entered in 2015. But what we can already see is that the arrival of Ukrainian refugees has strengthened the labor market focus of the integration policy. If you look across also Austrian news, you can see very much the discussion about we welcome Ukrainian refugees because they can work, they are needed at the labor market, and there is very little still discussion about the humanitarian response in general. So what do these developments actually mean if we look at the integration as this action net across levels? So if I start with the macro level or the institutional level, as I mentioned here, the important points are policies and the overall climate towards migration. And it is quite pointedly, if you look at the difference between the asylum seekers that came in 2015 and people that come from Ukraine seeking refuge right now in 2022. There has been at the EU level, which affects as well the Austrian level, quite significant development in terms of policies towards integration. The so-called EU's Temporary Protection Directive has been implemented for the first time. This is a directive that has actually been developed as a result of the Balkan Wars already in the 1990s, but has never been implemented so far. So the EU itself had, of course, the possibility to implement such a directive in 2015 when there was the first kind of large, let's say, refugee movement in Europe, but hasn't done so. And so for the Ukrainian refugees, this has been activated for the first time, which enables those people to access the labor market as well as other services such as education or healthcare. And I think this is crucial in terms of ease of support for those people, because also those organizations that are part of the action net, and I will come to the organizational level in a second, have a better policy that can help them in integrating those people into the labor market. There is very little restriction compared to those people that came as asylum seekers in 2015. And if you think about it, there is still a lot of people who are in the asylum procedure that came in 2015 who still have very little possibility to work. But overall, still funding for housing, schooling, and language courses is needed, also for new arrivals that came now in 2022. And if this is not provided by policy, then this is a problem for organizations that are aiming at supporting people getting into the labor market. And what does this mean at the organizational level? Meaning that early integration into work without sufficient support in other integration areas, and mainly education. And here we can talk about, of course, language education, but as well other types of education, but also health, and specifically mental health, support for trauma, etc. This is very difficult. Here, what is important is the role of those organizations that are from the public service, such as the public employment services. Their role is wide-reaching, as you can see here on this slide. And in a study that I have done last year with 2 colleagues, we have found out that their role is very broad. So they encompass, for example, strategy and implementation of labor market integration, but that they have very real challenges across those different levels that I mentioned, across the institutional, the organizational, and the individual levels. And from our study, 4 main points emerge, as you can see here on this graph. The first point is really taking mental health into consideration. So a lot of projects that we have examined in this study focus on labor market first policy, meaning getting people into employment as soon as possible. What has emerged then within 2 or 3 years is that a lot of people have unresolved issues due to trauma, due to experiences that they have made in war, and that they are further work is impacted by that. So that means that they can access the labor market, but that career trajectories are often impacted for years by unresolved mental health issues. For organizations, this is a big issue because they have very limited staff that is trained in helping people with mental health issues. And this is, on the one hand, this organizational problem with lacking of staff, but also an institutional problem with lacking funding for such staff that can help people with mental health consideration. Another point is that a lot of measures that are being taken for refugees to enter the labor market, for example, language courses or other types of education, is not really tailor-made for different refugee groups. So you have courses that are the same for people with very limited education and for those that have a high level of education. So what we have found out in the study is that there is a need for tailor-made measures for different refugee groups. A third point that a lot of support organizations have issues with or challenges with is the public-private cooperation. In 2015, where we have started our study, most of those organizations had very limited contacts with employers. Employers had done a couple of initiatives separately, but there was no systematic sort of connection with support organizations. This is now changing, and I will show an example shortly, but this is something that also the policy level needs to put emphasis on to ensure a better public-private cooperation, given that, of course, integration into the labor market is the first step, but employment happens within a company or within an organization. And companies, on the one hand, are open to employ people specifically in shortage occupations. So if you also look again at Austria and the context of shortage occupations, employers are calling, for ensuring employment also of refugees. But on the other hand, they have very limited support in dealing with all administrative issues that come with that. So this is an important point that still is not considered very well at the institutional level. And then a last point, which is connected to almost all of the 3 other points, is that support organizations have very limited amount of staff due to limited budgets, of course, and that the staff that they have is changing. So there is a high fluctuation because this is a quite intense job. And they lack targeted training and development of the staff. This is connected again to the issues of how to deal with people who have encountered trauma, but also how to deal with people from different cultural backgrounds, etc. And all of these challenges, of course, are at this organizational level with support organizations who are supposed to help refugees enter the labor market, but they're interconnected at the institutional level. Because, of course, without policies that foster these things, organizations can only do a limited amount of work with the budget that they have available and the staff that they have available. And you can see here actually a very nice example of how this public support organizations, and here this is the Public Employment Service in Austria, aim to support refugees, and how they also aim to overcome the challenges that I mentioned on the previous slide. And this is again a very good example as well of the Action Net, where the support organizations here are connecting refugees also with other organizations. So you can see here on the left side of this figure that all the offers that the Public Employment Service, the IMS in Austria, can offer refugees, what refugees need in order to receive those services, and how they can access those services. But if you look also at the right-hand side of the figure, you can see as well examples of connections to other organizations. So for example, for people, how they can recognize their qualifications, where can they learn German, and advice for specific groups of people, in this case women, because the majority of people actually that are coming to Austria and to other European countries from the Ukraine are women and children, also due to very difficult positions of men who are trying to leave the country. And another important player at the organizational level are, of course, employers. And the development of involving employers in labor market integration of refugees has been actually a very slow one, which is quite surprising for researchers who are looking at integration of refugees into the labor market. But so far, if you look at 2015 and the subsequent movements, employers have not been sufficiently involved, but we can see actually a better development right now since the arrival of Ukrainian refugees, where their role is stronger and where they are also communicating stronger their needs of people to access the labor market and to be able to fill, for example, shortages. And there are various initiatives also offered by employers and other organizations, again showing this refugee action net. So you can see on this slide one example that I've picked out in Austria, which shows very well how the network is organized in labor market integration in Austria and how complex this actually is. So this is a homepage that has been developed probably in, around March 2022, where an NGO has actually developed a homepage in support with many organizations that are part of the landscape in Austria and supporting refugees, like, for example, the Austrian Integration Fund. And they offer so-called Austrian jobs for Ukrainian refugees. And you can see here the different categories: tech jobs, hospitality jobs, and social jobs. So here on the tech jobs, so for example, a developer. Then hospitality jobs, you can see here looking for a cook, as well as social jobs like, for example, a nurse. What you can also see here is quite interesting, is that there are jobs at different levels, of course. So you can have a cook at a lower level of salary, for example, a developer at a higher level of salary, etc. And another important point, which is unfortunately not visible on the pictures, but you can look it up on the homepage itself, is that the information provided does not only concern jobs, but again, like in the previous example of the IMS, the information provided also is connection, for example, with universities, connection with institutes that are offering language courses, etc. So it shows really this network of organizations aiming at supporting refugees in their labor market integration. So the last level that we need to look at when discussing the integration in an action net across these different levels is, of course, the level of the individual or the refugees themselves. And here we are talking about skills that people bring with them and resources that people have. For example, childcare. I mentioned before that the majority of people coming in now from the Ukraine are women and children. So if the aim is to get women as soon as possible into the labor market, then an issue of childcare must be discussed across the organizational level, but as well as across the institutional level by providing, for example, more spaces in kindergarten, spaces in school, etc. Then another point that I mentioned before, the health issues of people coming in, specifically trauma-related issues, which might not be visible immediately, but which can over time become a hindrance in entering the labor market, but also in succeeding in the labor market itself or in employment itself. And as a last point, the agencies of refugees themselves. It is a big problem, of course, that people are being talked about and that they have no voice themselves. In Austria, there is currently a study ongoing in getting information about the needs of refugees. And first results actually show that a lot of people want to go back as soon as possible to their home country. So their interest in actually accessing the labor market very quickly might not be as high as employers or other organizations in the Action Net are expecting. Whether this is the reality is then another issue. So there is a lot of things at the individual level that organizations need to consider when looking at integrating refugees into the labor market. And last but not least, also how to find sustainable employment for people and not just a job sort of to survive the initial first weeks. So in summary, if we look at integration into the labor market, but also in society, this must be viewed as this complex action net involving multiple levels of governance and different challenges for individuals and actors involved. And you can see this actually here on this graph that I'm showing. And on this graph, I'm trying to show the canvas, the issues of the canvas ceiling, basically, by these different colors, as well as the action net of the different organizations involved in supporting refugees in the labor market integration. This is an example of Austria, where you have the different governmental levels, federal, states, and municipalities, as well as the two main players, the Austrian Integration Fund and the Public Employment Service, as well as NGOs or other support organizations, civil society. If you look at section at the session of Thomas Gegenhuber in this course, you can see a very nice example of civil society initiatives supporting refugees. But this complexity should be reflected in the role and tasks of actors involved in getting refugees into the labor market, and should be considered when designing integration policy at the highest level. So basically, how to involve employers best, how to involve civil society best, and acknowledge as well that this coordination and cooperation of different actors remains a complex issue. And a final point which I would like to make is actually that this labor market first policy, which is very prevalent in Austria, but also in other European countries, should be looked at critically, as refugees need time to adjust. As the example that I've given, that a lot of people are not even sure how long they will stay. They need to adjust to the new environment and also often accept their new position. And other integration domains, specifically health, but also housing and education, need to be taken into account. And thank you very much for your attention. You can see my contact details here. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out, and I hope you will find also the task interesting that I've given you, where you are supposed to look at the difference between the refugee movements in 2015 and now from Ukraine, and what it means across those three different levels for labor market integration. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.